In the winter of 1847, 17 young women stepped through the doors of the remote St. Margaret's Convent nestled in the hills of western Pennsylvania, their hearts full of devotion and their souls committed to God. By the time spring arrived, only 3 still drew breath, and those survivors refused to utter a single word about what had unfolded during those dark months within the convent's walls. For more than a century, the Catholic Church kept the official record locked away from the world. But recently uncovered letters from the sole surviving nun expose a horror so deeply disturbing that it calls into question everything we believed we understood about religious devotion and human nature. What drove 14 faithful women to their deaths in a place that was supposed to be a refuge? And why did the Church go to such extraordinary lengths to bury this story? The answer lies hidden within testimony so shocking that even hardened Church investigators couldn't bring themselves to make it public. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on the truth about the nuns who never took their final vows. Before we go any further into the story of St. Margaret's Convent, I want you to know that this channel isn't meant for everyone, only for the boldest souls who can stomach the darkest mysteries buried within our history. If you're one of those true seekers of mystery, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. And I'm curious, where are you tuning in from tonight? Drop a comment with your state or city, because these stories have a way of connecting us all across this country. Now, let's walk into the shadows of 1847 and uncover what truly happened in those Pennsylvania hills. The story begins during an era when America was still searching for its religious identity, and the Catholic Church was fighting to establish itself within a predominantly Protestant nation. The year 1847 marked a pivotal moment for Catholic communities spread across America. As wave after wave of Irish immigrants fled the devastation of the Great Famine, the Church struggled to offer spiritual guidance and shelter to its rapidly growing flock. Pennsylvania, with the tradition of religious tolerance that the Quakers had long established, had become something of a refuge for Catholic institutions, but genuine acceptance remained far from certain. Protestant communities regarded Catholic convents with deep suspicion, spreading tales of secret rituals and the forced imprisonment of young women. Anti-Catholic sentiment ran especially high in western Pennsylvania, where Protestant families had planted roots generations earlier and viewed the expanding Catholic presence as a direct threat to everything they had built. Newspapers churned out sensational stories about convents, portraying them as prisons where young women were held captive against their will. The Know Nothing Party, a political movement built around limiting Catholic influence, had gathered considerable support throughout the region, making life increasingly difficult for Catholic institutions trying to find their footing. St. Margaret's Convent rose like a fortress of faith among the rolling hills of Westmoreland County, 30 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. The imposing stone structure, built in 1832 by German craftsmen, stretched 3 stories against the gray winter sky. Its Gothic windows seemed to gaze down upon the valley below, while a bell tower reached toward heaven like an outstretched finger. The building's architecture was deliberately commanding, designed to stir both awe and reverence in equal measure. Thick limestone walls quarried from local bedrock kept the interior cool during summer and bitterly cold through winter. The narrow windows admitted little natural light, casting the interior in a state of near-perpetual twilight that seemed to absorb both voices and footsteps. The convent was home to the Sisters of Divine Mercy, a strict order that had arrived recently from France, bringing with them old-world traditions that struck American sensibilities as almost medieval in nature. Unlike the more familiar orders that operated schools and hospitals, the Sisters of Divine Mercy devoted themselves exclusively to what they called the perfection of the soul through suffering. They accepted only young women between the ages of 18 and 25, and only those capable of demonstrating both exceptional piety and unusual physical endurance. Mother Superior Agatha Rousseau, governed the convent with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove. At 53, she carried herself with the bearing of European nobility, speaking English with a heavy French accent that made even the simplest prayers sound foreign and mysterious. Her pale blue eyes missed absolutely nothing, and the younger nuns often whispered among themselves that she had the ability to peer directly into their souls. Mother Agatha had fled France during the political upheavals of the 1830s, bringing with her a collection of religious artifacts and manuscripts she claimed traced back to the earliest days of the Christian Church. She regarded America as a spiritual wasteland in desperate need of cultivation through rigid discipline and unwavering faith. The Mother Superior's past was shrouded in mystery. She claimed to have served in convents throughout Europe, but when Bishop Patrick O'Malley of Pittsburgh had sought references from French religious authorities, he received only vague replies about administrative changes and relocated personnel. What was undeniable was that Mother Agatha possessed an encyclopedic command of Catholic doctrine and an unshakable certainty that modern religious practices had grown far too lenient, too willing to accommodate human weakness. The convent's daily routine was punishing by design. The sisters rose at 4 in the morning for matins, their bare feet meeting cold stone floors as they made their way to the chapel by candlelight. Breakfast consisted of thin gruel and stale bread, consumed in complete silence while Mother Agatha read passages from obscure theological texts. The hours were filled with silent prayer, back-breaking labor in the gardens and kitchens, and the study of religious manuscripts composed in Latin and French. Communication was restricted to essential matters, and laughter was treated as a sign of spiritual weakness, requiring immediate correction through extended periods of solitary prayer. The novices, those young women preparing to take their final vows, faced an even harsher regimen. They were expected to prove their dedication through increasingly demanding acts of penance and self-denial. Simple meals gave way to fasting. Comfortable sleeping arrangements were replaced by nights spent kneeling on stone floors. Private prayer became public confession of even the smallest doubts or impure thoughts. Mother Agatha explained that this process was necessary to strip away the corrupting influences of the outside world and prepare the soul for complete union with the divine. Sister Catherine Murphy, barely 21 years old, had arrived at St. Margaret's in the fall of 1846, carrying dreams of serving the poor and spreading God's love. The daughter of Irish immigrants, she had grown up in the slums of Philadelphia, where she had witnessed firsthand the suffering of her people. Her father, Thomas Murphy, had been a dock worker who succumbed to consumption when Catherine was just 16. Her mother, navigating the space between two cultures, had taught Catherine to read and write in both English and Gaelic, skills that set her apart from many of her peers. Catherine's faith was her anchor in a world that seemed intent on breaking the spirits of the poor and the immigrant. She had witnessed the charity of the Sisters of Charity, who operated a small clinic in her neighborhood, and their example had lit the flame of her desire for a religious life. But the comfortable warmth of the Philadelphia Sisters' mission bore almost no resemblance to the harsh reality she discovered behind the walls of St. Margaret's Convent. Catherine's letters to her family, uncovered decades later in a trunk stored in the convent's attic, reveal a young woman of extraordinary compassion and intelligence, but also one who was growing increasingly disturbed by what she was witnessing behind those walls. The winter of 1847 bore down on Pennsylvania with particular ferocity. Snow began to fall in November and refused to relent until March, piling up in drifts that climbed to the second-story windows of the convent. The isolation became total. No visitors, no mail, no contact with the outside world beyond the weekly visit from Father Heinrich Metz, an elderly German priest who tended to the scattered Catholic communities throughout the region. Even those visits grew irregular as the roads became impassable, leaving the convent completely cut off from any form of outside oversight. Food supplies, already kept deliberately meager, dwindled to dangerous levels. The convent's gardens lay buried beneath 6 feet of snow, and the root cellar's stores of preserved vegetables began running low by January. But Mother Agatha refused to ease the demanding physical labor that formed part of the daily routine. If anything, she intensified the requirements, insisting that physical hardship was a pathway to spiritual enlightenment. The novices grew thin and pale, their movements becoming sluggish as hunger and cold steadily claimed their strength. But hunger was the least of the novices' worries. Mother Agatha had announced in December that this winter would serve as a special test of faith, a purification designed to separate the truly dedicated from the merely curious. She spoke of ancient traditions, of practices that had been lost as the modern church made its accommodations to worldly concerns. The worthy would be elevated to a new plane of spiritual understanding, while the unworthy would be redirected toward more suitable paths of service. On the night of December 13th, 1847, Sister Catherine was jolted awake not by the usual morning bell, but by a sound that would haunt her dreams for the remainder of her life. The soft, desperate sobbing of her roommate, Sister Mary Agnes O'Brien, a girl of 19 who had arrived from Boston just 2 months earlier. When Catherine whispered to ask what was wrong, Mary Agnes seized her arm with surprising strength and pulled her close, her breath hot against Catherine's ear. "They're taking us to the chapel," Mary Agnes whispered, her voice trembling with barely restrained terror. "One by one in the middle of the night, and some of us don't come back the same. Sister Elizabeth came back 3 nights ago, but she's not Elizabeth anymore. She doesn't speak, doesn't eat the same food as us, and I saw her drinking something red from a cup that Mother Agatha gave her. Her eyes, Catherine, her eyes reflect light like an animal's. The chapel at St. Margaret's was unlike anything Catherine had encountered before. Built into the basement of the convent, it had been carved directly from the limestone bedrock, creating a cave-like atmosphere that seemed to consume both light and sound. The walls wept moisture continuously, producing strange patterns that appeared to shift and move in the flickering candlelight. Strange symbols had been etched into the stone, not the familiar Christian imagery of crosses and saints, but something far older, far more primitive. Spirals that seemed to pull the eye inward, geometric patterns that caused discomfort when looked at directly, symbols that resembled twisted human forms engaged in acts Catherine couldn't quite make out. Mother Agatha claimed they were ancient Christian symbols from the catacombs of Rome, representations of the earliest martyrs' devotion to their faith. But Sister Catherine, educated in a convent school in Philadelphia by Irish sisters who prided themselves on their knowledge of church history, had never encountered anything remotely like them. The symbols seemed to predate Christianity entirely, reaching back to traditions that the early church had supposedly wiped out centuries ago. The chapel's altar was particularly unsettling. Rather than the traditional stone slab, it consisted of a circular depression carved into the living rock, surrounded by channels that disappeared into darkness. Mother Agatha explained that this design was intended for the proper collection and consecration of offerings, though she never specified what those offerings might be. The altar was stained with something dark that had soaked deep into the porous stone, forming patterns that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. That night, as the clock tower chimed midnight, Mother Agatha appeared at their dormitory door, accompanied by 2 senior sisters. Their faces were concealed beneath heavy veils that covered not merely their heads, but their features entirely, leaving only dark openings where their eyes should have been. They carried candles that burned with an unusual flame, not the familiar warm yellow glow of ordinary candles, but a cold blue-white light that cast strange shadows and made familiar objects look alien and threatening. Sister Mary Agnes, Mother Agatha's voice barely rose above a whisper, yet it carried clearly through the dormitory. "It is time for your private examination of faith. You have been chosen for a special honor, one that will test your dedication to our sacred mission. Come with us willingly, and you will be rewarded with an understanding beyond your current comprehension." Catherine watched in horror as her roommate was led away, her bare feet making no sound on the cold stone floor. Mary Agnes looked back just once, her eyes wide with terror, and Catherine saw her lips form words that produced no sound. "Help me." The door closed with a finality that seemed to resonate through the building like the ceiling of a tomb. Catherine pressed her ear against the thick wooden door, straining for any sound from the corridor, but the walls swallowed everything whole. She positioned herself by the narrow window, watching for any movement in the chapel windows visible from her dormitory, but heavy curtains had been drawn across every opening. The only light came from an eerie glow that seemed to emanate from the chapel itself, as though the very stones had become luminescent. Hours crawled past. Catherine dozed fitfully, snapping awake at every sound, real or imagined. Just before dawn, she heard footsteps in the corridor. Slow, measured steps that didn't quite sound like Mary Agnes's quick, nervous pace. The dormitory door swung open, and a figure stepped inside. In the dim on light, Catherine could see that it was indeed Mary Agnes, yet something was fundamentally, disturbingly different about her. Mary Agnes moved with a fluid grace that seemed deeply unnatural. Her characteristic nervous energy had been replaced by an almost predatory stillness. When she turned to look at Catherine, her eyes caught the faint light filtering through the window and reflected it back with an intensity that made Catherine's breath seize in her chest. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw something moving within those reflected eyes, something that writhed and twisted like smoke trapped behind glass. "Mary Agnes," Catherine whispered, but her roommate didn't respond. Instead, she drifted to her bed with that same eerie grace and lay down fully clothed, staring up at the ceiling with those strangely luminous eyes. She remained that way until the morning bell rang, never moving, never blinking, as though suspended in some kind of trance. When the other novices began to stir and prepare for morning prayers, Mary Agnes suddenly sat bolt upright and looked around as if seeing the dormitory for the very first time. But when Catherine attempted to speak with her, Mary Agnes responded with confusion and alarm, insisting she couldn't remember anything about the night before. She claimed she had slept soundly and had no idea why Catherine was asking such strange questions. But Catherine noticed other changes in her roommate as the days went by. Mary Agnes, who had always consumed scripture with a voracious appetite, now seemed incapable of focusing on religious texts for more than a few minutes at a stretch. She complained that the words appeared to move across the page, rearranging themselves into patterns that made no sense to her. During prayers, she would sometimes stop mid-sentence and stare into the middle distance, as though she were listening to voices only she could hear. Most troubling of all, Catherine noticed that Mary Agnes had stopped eating the same meals as the other novices. She would sit at the communal table, pushing food around her plate, but never actually swallowing anything. Yet she showed none of the weakness and hunger that were visibly consuming the other sisters. If anything, she seemed stronger and more energetic than before, her skin taking on an almost luminous quality that made her stand out sharply among the pale, undernourished novices. 3 days after Mary Agnes's midnight visit to the chapel, Catherine was assigned to clean the sacred space as part of her daily duties. As she scrubbed the stone floors and polished the strange altar, she discovered something that turned her blood to ice. Scratched into the stone floor near the back of the chapel, barely visible unless you knew precisely where to look, were words carved with something sharp and deliberate. "They are not what they seem. The old ways never died here. Trust no one, especially those who return changed. Find the hidden room behind the altar. The truth is written in the stones. Save yourself while you still can. M.A." Oh, Catherine recognized the handwriting immediately from the prayer books and study sessions she and Mary Agnes had shared. The letters were fresh, carved recently, and positioned in a spot that only someone scrubbing the floor would ever discover. But the message raised far more questions than it answered. What old ways? What hidden room? And most terrifyingly, what had been done to Mary Agnes that she could leave such a warning, and then appear to have no memory of ever having done so. The discovery of Mary Agnes's hidden message permanently transformed the way Catherine saw everything happening around her at St. Margaret's Convent. She began to study her surroundings with the careful, methodical attention of someone whose life might depend on noticing what others had missed. What she uncovered over the weeks that followed painted a portrait of an institution bearing no resemblance to any religious house she had ever heard described. The winter deepened, and with it came a routine Catherine gradually recognized as ritualistic in nature. Every few nights, Mother Agatha would materialize at the dormitory doors, always at the stroke of midnight, always accompanied by the same two veiled sisters whose faces remained hidden even in broad daylight. She would call a name, always in that same whisper that somehow traveled clearly through the stone corridors, and the chosen novice would follow without question, as though they had been stripped of any choice in the matter. Catherine began keeping careful records, scratching marks into the wooden beam beneath her bed, where they would escape notice during the daily inspections. By the end of January, 8 novices had been summoned for these midnight examinations. Of those 8, 3 had never returned to the dormitory at all. The others had come back changed in ways that became increasingly apparent with each passing day. Sister Elizabeth Hartwell, who had been called on the 3rd night, returned with an otherworldly pallor and eyes that seemed to contain depths Catherine couldn't begin to measure. She stopped engaging in conversation entirely, responding to direct questions with nothing more than simple nods or shakes of her head. During communal prayers, she would sometimes begin speaking in a language none of the other novices could identify, not Latin, not French, but something that sounded far older and far more guttural. Sister Sarah Morton, summoned a week later, developed a pronounced aversion to the crosses and religious imagery decorating the convent. She would flinch when passing the crucifix hanging in the main corridor, and during chapel services, she positioned herself as far from the altar as the space would allow. When questioned about her behavior, she claimed the symbols caused her genuine physical pain, as if they were scorching her skin from a distance. Sister Rebecca Stone, the youngest of the group at barely 18, returned from her midnight examination possessing knowledge she could not conceivably have gained through any ordinary means. She began speaking fluent Latin during prayers, despite having struggled with even the most basic phrases before her disappearance. More disturbing still, she demonstrated an intimate familiarity with church history and theological debate that would have demanded years of dedicated study to acquire. When fellow novices pressed her about this sudden transformation, she would smile with an expression that seemed far too aged for her youthful face and say only that she had been blessed with excellent teachers. The remaining novices clustered together during the rare moments when speaking was permitted, exchanging theories and fears in voices barely louder than their breathing. Some believed the missing sisters had been quietly transferred to other convents as part of their training. Others speculated that they had been so overtaken by religious fervor that they had chosen lives of hermetic isolation somewhere in the vast convent basement. But Catherine's darkening suspicion ran far deeper than any of these hopeful explanations. She had begun to notice that the senior sisters, who should have been equally weakened by the same meager diet and brutal conditions plaguing the novices, appeared robust and radiantly healthy. Their skin glowed with a vitality that seemed almost unnatural, and their eyes held a light that appeared to originate from somewhere within rather than from any external source. They moved through the corridors with a grace and energy that defied any rational explanation, given the harsh conditions of their supposed ascetic life. More troubling still, Catherine had begun hearing sounds drifting up from the basement chapel that resisted any reasonable explanation. During the deepest, darkest hours of the night, when the convent should have been silent save for the wind and the settling of old stones, she could detect rhythmic chanting in a language she did not recognize. The voices were neither purely male nor purely female, but something between the two, weaving harmonies that seemed to travel through the stone walls and resonate within her very bones. Accompanying the chanting, she would sometimes hear what sounded like crying or perhaps singing, so warped by the stone acoustics that it was impossible to determine which. On one particularly still night, she clearly heard what sounded like laughter. Not the joyful sound of human amusement, but something cold and calculated that raised the hair on the back of her neck. The laughter was accompanied by other sounds she couldn't identify. Rhythmic tapping, the grinding of stone against stone, and something that sounded disturbingly like liquid dripping steadily onto the chapel floor. Catherine's investigation drew her deeper into areas of the convent that were supposedly forbidden to novices. During her assigned cleaning duties, she began constructing a mental map of the building's layout, noting discrepancies between its external appearance and its internal organization. The convent was larger than it appeared from the outside, with corridors that seemed to reach further into the hillside than the building's footprint should have permitted. In the basement where the chapel was located, she discovered a network of tunnels and chambers that appeared on no architectural plan she had ever seen. Some of these spaces served practical purposes: storage rooms, wine cellars, and workshops where the sisters prepared medicines and preserved food. But others seemed to serve no obvious function whatsoever, consisting of empty chambers carved directly from the bedrock, their walls blanketed in the same strange symbols that decorated the chapel. Her most significant discovery came when Catherine located what Mary Agnes's message had described as the hidden room behind the altar. During one of her chapel cleaning sessions, she noticed that the stones behind the altar didn't align quite correctly. Closer inspection revealed that one section of the wall was in fact a cleverly disguised door, operated by pressing a sequence of symbols carved into the stone in a specific order. Inside the hidden chamber, Catherine found a sight that overturned everything she believed she understood about the Sisters of Divine Mercy. The room was crowded with books and manuscripts, but these were not the religious texts one would expect to discover in a convent library. Many were written in languages she couldn't identify, their pages dense with diagrams and illustrations depicting practices that had nothing whatsoever to do with Christianity. Some of the manuscripts were clearly ancient, their vellum pages yellowed with age and their ink faded to a warm brown. Others appeared far more recent, composed in fresh ink on quality paper. What united them all was a singular focus on what Catherine could only describe as transformation. Detailed instructions for fundamentally altering human beings through ritualistic practices that seemed to blend elements of religion, medicine, and something far, far darker. One particular manuscript, written in French, seized Catherine's attention because she could comprehend portions of it. The text described something called la transformation divine, the divine transformation, a process by which ordinary human beings could be elevated to a higher state of existence. But the methods it described were horrifying in their clinical precision. The transformation required the systematic dismantling of the subject's original personality and the construction of something new and fundamentally different in its place. The process involved isolation, sensory deprivation, and the gradual introduction of what the text called the sacred substance, a liquid described as having been consecrated through ancient rituals, passed down through generations of initiates. Subjects who received this substance gradually lost their original memories and personalities, becoming vessels for something else entirely. The text spoke of shared consciousness and collective wisdom, but the descriptions read far more like accounts of possession than of any form of spiritual elevation. The most chilling discovery of all was a ledger written in Mother Agatha's unmistakable handwriting. The book contained meticulous records of every young woman who had entered St. Margaret's Convent across the previous 15 years. Not just the current group of novices, but dozens upon dozens of others whose names Catherine had never once heard spoken aloud. Each entry detailed the girl's background, her reasons for seeking a religious vocation, and careful observations about her physical and mental characteristics. More disturbing still were the notations tracking each girl's progress through what the ledger called the selection process. Some entries were marked successfully integrated, accompanied by dates and descriptions of their newly assigned roles within the convent hierarchy. Others were labeled unsuitable for integration, followed by dates and cryptic notes about alternative arrangements. A handful of entries ended simply with the word consumed and a date, with nothing further to explain it. The ledger's most recent entries concerned Catherine's current group of novices. Each girl was described in clinical detail, with careful assessments of her potential for successful transformation. Catherine's own entry made her hands tremble as she read it. Highly intelligent, strong-willed, demonstrates troubling independence of thought. Potential for integration unclear, may require special handling if resistance develops. Monitor closely for signs of awareness. Catherine understood with growing dread that she had stumbled upon evidence of something far exceeding simple religious corruption. This was a systematic operation that had been consuming young women for more than a decade, transforming some into something inhuman while disposing of others in ways the ledger did not specify. The question that terrified her most was devastatingly simple. How long before her own name appeared in that final column? The knowledge Catherine had gained from the hidden chamber became a terrible weight to carry. She now understood that St. Margaret's convent was not merely a house of harsh religious discipline, but something infinitely more sinister. A carefully constructed trap engineered to ensnare young women seeking spiritual fulfillment. But knowing the truth and acting on it were two entirely different things. How could she warn the other novices without revealing how she had come to possess such information? And more critically, how could she convince anyone of something so utterly unbelievable? The answer came when Catherine recognized that she was not the only one who had begun to notice the disturbing changes in their companions. Sister Margaret O'Brien, a sharp-eyed girl from Boston whose father was a physician, had been conducting her own quiet observations about the altered behavior of the novices who had returned from their midnight examinations. During a brief window when they were permitted to speak while working in the kitchen together, Catherine managed to whisper a single word that carried the weight of everything. Basement. That night, Margaret slipped away from her dormitory and met Catherine in the storage room adjacent to the kitchen. The space was cramped and cold, packed with sacks of grain and barrels of preserved vegetables, but it offered the privacy they desperately needed. When Catherine shared excerpts from the manuscript she had discovered and walked Margaret through what she had learned from Mother Agatha's ledger, Margaret's face drained to the color of parchment. "I knew something was deeply wrong," Margaret whispered, her medical background helping her absorb the horrifying information more rapidly than most might have managed. "My roommate, Sister Elizabeth, came back from one of those midnight visits as a completely different person. I've been watching her carefully. She doesn't eat the food anymore. She goes through motions moving things around her plate, but she never actually swallows anything. And I've seen her drinking something else, something thick and dark red that Mother Agatha brings her in a special cup." Margaret's observations added crucial layers to Catherine's growing understanding of the situation. Raised by a physician and trained to notice changes in human behavior and physiology that others would overlook, she had catalogued a pattern of alterations in the returned novices that went far beyond simple shifts in personality. "Their body temperature has changed," Margaret explained, her voice barely audible in the cramped storage room. "When we're working together in the kitchen, I've noticed their skin is cold to the touch, even when the rest of us are flushed from standing near the fire. And their breathing, sometimes they go for entire minutes without drawing a single breath, as if they have simply forgotten that breathing is something they need to do at all." The two young women came to realize they were not alone in their growing awareness. Over the following days, they carefully identified 3 other novices who had noticed the changes but hadn't yet understood what they meant. Sister Anne Fitzgerald, barely 18 and paralyzed by what she was witnessing, had been scratching prayers into the walls of her cell, begging for protection from something she couldn't name. Sister Rose McKenna, whose roommate had vanished entirely the week before, had taken to sleeping with a makeshift cross clutched in her hands, claiming it was the only thing that made her feel safe. And Sister Clara Walsh, the most intellectually restless of the group, had been conducting her own quiet investigation into the convent's history. Clara's research had uncovered troubling patterns buried in the local records. Having gained access to the convent's official correspondence through her duties as Mother Agatha's secretary, she had spotted discrepancies between the convent's internal documents and the report being sent to the bishop in Pittsburgh, according to the official reports sent. Margaret's convent had successfully trained and ordained dozens of sisters over the past 15 years, dispatching them to serve in parishes across the country. But Clara had been unable to locate any trace of these supposedly ordained sisters anywhere in the church's actual records. More alarming still, Clara had discovered that several families throughout the region had made inquiries about daughters who had entered St. Margaret's but had never been heard from again. The convent's responses to these families followed a consistent, well-worn pattern. The young women had supposedly been called to serve in remote missions, or had chosen lives of complete contemplative silence that precluded all contact with the outside world. Families were assured their daughters were happy and fulfilled in their religious vocations, but no evidence of this happiness was ever actually provided. As the 5 remaining unaltered novices began sharing what each had learned, a picture emerged of an operation far more sophisticated and long-running than any of them had initially imagined. The Sisters of Divine Mercy were not simply a corrupt religious order, but something that had infiltrated the Catholic Church to serve its own purposes. They had chosen their location with great deliberateness, remote enough to avoid regular oversight, yet accessible enough to attract young women seeking religious life. Their recruitment methods were subtle but devastatingly effective, targeting girls from poor families who would not be missed quickly, or those from distant locations whose families would face enormous difficulty investigating their disappearance. The 5 survivors began to meet in secret, pooling their knowledge and developing theories about what was truly happening at St. Margaret's Convent. Catherine shared her discoveries from the hidden chamber, while Margaret provided medical insight into the physical changes she had documented. Clara contributed detailed knowledge of the convent's operations and correspondence, while Anne and Rose shared their careful observations about the daily habits and behaviors of the senior sisters. Through these conversations, they began to piece together an understanding of a transformation process that was both gradual and irreversible. The midnight examinations were not isolated events, but the opening act of a systematic process of psychological and physical alteration that could stretch across weeks or months. The novices who returned from these sessions were at various stages of transformation, their original personalities being slowly replaced by something else altogether. Perhaps the most disturbing realization of all was that the senior sisters themselves had once been young women exactly like them. Mother Agatha's ledger made references to the founding sisters who had established the convent, but older records suggested that these women had originally arrived in America as novices seeking religious life just as they had. Over time, they had been transformed into the very creatures they now served, surrendering their original identities to become instruments of whatever force was guiding the entire operation. The 5 young women began to plan their escape, but they quickly confronted the full magnitude of the obstacles before them. The convent was cut off from civilization by miles of wilderness, and the brutal winter conditions made travel on foot virtually suicidal. Even if they somehow managed to reach the outside world, who on earth would believe their story? They had no physical evidence capable of convincing any authority, and their claims would almost certainly be dismissed as the delusions of hysterical young women. Worse still, they began to detect signs that their secret meetings had not gone unnoticed. Mother Agatha's demeanor toward them grew increasingly cold and calculating, and the senior sisters had begun watching them with an intensity that suggested full awareness of the growing resistance. Within their walls, the 5 novices recognized that time was running out. Their own midnight examinations would come soon, and once they did, they would either be transformed like the others or vanish without explanation. The breaking point arrived on the night of March 10th, 1847, when the 5 surviving novices discovered that their secret gatherings had been completely exposed. As they assembled in the storage room for what they had planned as a final strategy session, they found Mother Agatha waiting for them, seated calmly atop a barrel of grain with her hands folded neatly in her lap. The cold smile playing across her face told them everything they needed to know about how effective their supposed secrecy had truly been. "My dear children?" Mother Agatha's voice carried its usual silk-over-steel quality, but now Catherine could detect something else running beneath the surface, something that sounded almost like amusement. "Did you truly believe your little gatherings had gone unnoticed? This building has been our home for 15 years. We know every stone, every shadow, every whisper that travels through these halls. We have been watching you, listening to you, learning about your fears and your hopes and your rather pathetic attempts at resistance." The senior sisters emerged from the shadows where they had been concealed, surrounding the 5 terrified novices with the coordinated precision of predators who had executed this exact maneuver many times before. In the flickering candlelight, Catherine could see that their faces were no longer hidden behind veils. For the first time, she looked directly at the features of the women who had been directing the convent's activities, and what she saw challenged her understanding of what was biologically possible. These were not the faces of middle-aged religious women weathered by years of ascetic living. The skin was too smooth, too pale, stretched too tightly over bone structure that seemed subtly, fundamentally wrong. Cheekbones too sharp, jaws too angular, eye sockets carved too deep. Most disturbing of all were their eyes, which reflected candlelight with an intensity that reminded Catherine of nocturnal predators. When they smiled, their teeth appeared longer and sharper than any normal human dentition, and their movements possessed a fluid grace suggesting that the joints and muscles beneath their skin operated according to entirely different rules than those governing human anatomy. "We want you to understand," Mother Agatha continued, rising from her seat with that same unnatural grace, "that we bear you no ill will. What we offer is not punishment, but elevation. You have been chosen not for death, but for transformation into something far superior to what you currently are. The fear you feel is completely natural. It is the fear of the caterpillar that must die so that the butterfly may be born." Catherine found her voice, though it trembled as the words left her. "What are you? What have you done to the others?" Mother Agatha's smile widened, revealing those unnaturally sharp teeth. "We are what humanity can become when it finally abandons the limitations imposed by your primitive understanding of existence. Your friends, your roommates, your fellow novices, they have all been given the opportunity to transcend their mortal boundaries. Some embraced this gift willingly. Others required greater persuasion. But all have contributed to our great work in one way or another." Margaret stepped forward, her medical training lending her the courage to voice the question they all feared to ask. "And those who couldn't be transformed, what became of them? Nothing is ever wasted," Mother Agatha replied, her tone becoming almost conversational. "Those who proved unsuitable for elevation served other purposes. Their life force, their essence, their vital energy, all of it contributed to sustaining those of us who have already achieved transformation. It is a beautiful cycle, really. The weak nourish the strong, the temporary sustains the eternal, the mortal feeds the immortal." The senior sisters began to close their circle tighter, and Catherine could now see that some of them were carrying objects she hadn't noticed before. Cups fashioned from what appeared to be tarnished silver, filled with a thick liquid that seemed to move of its own accord. The smell emanating from these cups was overwhelming, a combination of copper pennies and rotting flowers that made her stomach lurch. It was the same smell she had noticed clinging to the returned novices, the scent she had previously attributed to the herbs used during their mysterious prayers. The choice before you is quite simple, Mother Agatha explained, her pale eyes moving deliberately from one young face to the next. You may join us willingly, retaining some portion of your original consciousness throughout the transformation process. This path is less traumatic and allows for a far smoother integration into our community, or you may resist, in which case the transformation will be forced upon you, resulting in a considerably less pleasant experience and a more thorough erasure of your original personality. Anne began to sob, the sound echoing strangely within the confined space. We just wanted to serve God, she whispered. We came here to dedicate our lives to helping others, and so you shall, Mother Agatha assured her, reaching out to stroke Anne's hair with fingers that seemed too long and too pale. But you will serve powers far older and far more magnificent than the pale god your ignorant masses worship. You will become part of something that has existed since long before your Christ walked the earth, something that has concealed itself within the structures of organized religion for over 1,000 years, feeding on the faith of the innocent and growing stronger with every generation. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror inside St. Margaret's Convent takes a darker turn still. If this story is raising goosebumps, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to help support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Let's find out together what happens next in Catherine's desperate fight for survival. Rose found the courage to speak, her voice steadier than the others expected. You're talking about demons, you're talking about taking our souls. Mother Agatha laughed, a sound like breaking glass in the confined space. Demons, souls, such impossibly primitive concepts. We are evolution, child. We are what your species will become once it finally abandons the superstitions that have shackled it for millennia. There are no demons here, only beings who have mastered the art of transcending the limitations of mortality. There are no souls being sold, only consciousness being elevated to a higher plane of existence. The senior sisters continued to close their circle, and Catherine could see that some of them had raised the cups they carried. The thick liquid within seemed to pulse with a life entirely its own. The process is quite straightforward, Mother Agatha explained, her tone shifting to that of a teacher addressing students. The sacred substance you see before you has been consecrated through rituals tracing back to the very earliest days of human civilization. When consumed, it initiates the breakdown of your current limitations, preparing your consciousness for integration with our collective wisdom. The transformation takes several days to complete, during which time you will experience visions and sensations beyond anything your current limited perception can even begin to imagine. Margaret's medical instincts surged forward, and she began backing away from the approaching sisters. That's poison. You're describing poisoning us. Poison is such an ugly word, Mother Agatha replied smoothly. Medicine can be poison and poison can be medicine. It all depends entirely on dosage and intended outcome. What we offer transforms rather than destroys, elevates rather than degrades. Your friend, Mary Agnes, discovered this for herself. She resisted the process initially, but now she serves willingly and joyfully. Catherine's mind raced as she processed what she was hearing. The implications were staggering. If Mother Agatha was telling the truth, then St. Margaret's Convent was not an isolated aberration, but a single node within a vast network of corruption that had embedded itself within religious institutions across centuries. How many convents, monasteries, and churches harbored similar secrets? How many young people seeking spiritual fulfillment had instead found only death or transformation into something that no longer resembled anything human? But far more immediately pressing was the question of escape. The 5 novices were trapped in a small room with no other exits, surrounded by creatures that clearly possessed superhuman strength and coordination. The winter storm raging outside meant that even if they could somehow fight past their captors, death by exposure in the Pennsylvania wilderness would almost certainly await them. Clara, who had remained silent throughout the entire confrontation, suddenly spoke with a clarity that startled everyone present. You're not genuinely offering us a choice. You're going to transform us whether we agree or not. The only difference is how much of ourselves we're permitted to keep during the process. Mother Agatha nodded approvingly, as if Clara had successfully passed some kind of test. Very perceptive, child. You understand the situation perfectly. Intelligence like yours will prove particularly valuable to our collective consciousness. Yes, you will all be transformed, but your disposition toward the process will determine how much of your original personality survives the integration. Willing subjects retain far more of their individual memories and characteristics. Resistant subjects become considerably more uniform in their thinking and behavior. The senior sisters raised their cups in unison, the thick liquid within them pulsing as if alive. Catherine could see that the substance was not entirely liquid. Darker elements were suspended within it, moving independently, like tiny creatures swimming through a crimson sea. "We will begin with the most resistant," Mother Agatha announced, her gaze settling with unmistakable deliberateness on Catherine. "Sister Catherine Murphy, you have demonstrated the greatest independence of thought and the most troubling inclination toward investigation. You will be the first to experience the complete transformation process, and you will serve as an example to the others of what awaits them." Catherine felt a surge of pure terror move through her. But beneath it, something else stirred, a cold, precise anger that surprised her with its force. These creatures had killed or transformed dozens of young women, had corrupted a sacred institution for their own purposes, and had hidden their activities for decades behind the facade of religious devotion. If she was going to die here, she would not go quietly. "You made one critical mistake," Catherine said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "You assumed we came here tonight without a plan." Mother Agatha's confident expression flickered just for a moment. "What do you mean?" Catherine allowed herself a small smile, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "We know about the hidden chamber behind the altar. We know about your ledger and your records, and most importantly, we know about the letters." In truth, Catherine was bluffing desperately, buying time while she searched for any possible avenue of escape. But her words had an unexpected and immediate effect on the senior sisters, who exchanged glances that betrayed genuine concern. "What letters?" Mother Agatha demanded, her composure slipping visibly for the first time. "The letters we've been sending to Bishop O'Malley in Pittsburgh," Clara added, seamlessly picking up the thread of Catherine's deception. "Detailed accounts of everything we've observed here, hidden and ready to be delivered the moment anything happens to us." This was only partially true. Clara had indeed been documenting their discoveries, though the letters existed only in rough draft form, concealed within her prayer book. But the effect on their captives was immediate and dramatic. Mother Agatha's face contorted with fury, her carefully maintained human appearance beginning to fracture and dissolve. "Impossible," she hissed. "We monitor all correspondence. Nothing leaves this place without our knowledge." "Father Metz," Margaret said suddenly, inspiration striking her. "The old German priest who visits every week. He's been carrying our letters to the bishop without your knowledge. By now, investigators are very likely already on their way." This was a complete fabrication. Father Metz's visits had been suspended since January due to the severe weather, but the lie found its mark with devastating effectiveness. Mother Agatha let out a sound that was more animal than human, and the other senior sisters began to move with agitated, jerky motions, suggesting they were losing command of their carefully maintained human facades. "You meddling, foolish children," Mother Agatha snarled, her voice now carrying harmonics that no human throat should have been able to produce. "Do you have any idea what you've done? We have operated in secrecy for decades, steadily building our strength, preparing for the day when we could finally step out of the shadows. Your interference threatens everything we have worked to achieve." The senior sisters were transforming before their eyes, their human appearances dissolving like masks made of morning mist. What emerged from beneath was far worse than anything Catherine's darkest nightmares had ever conjured. Creatures that might once have been human, but had been so thoroughly altered that only the faintest traces of their original forms survived. Their limbs were too long, jointed in ways that violated every natural law of anatomy. Their skin had taken on a translucent quality that revealed the sluggish movement of dark fluids beneath the surface. Most horrifying of all, their faces had become fluid and malleable, shifting freely between recognizably human features and something far more ancient and predatory. What happened next would challenge every assumption Catherine had ever held about divine intervention and the power of genuine faith to overcome evil. As Mother Agatha raised her cup toward Catherine's lips, preparing to begin the forced transformation, the storage room was suddenly filled with a sound that made the ancient stone walls of Convent tremble to their foundations. The clear, ringing tone of church bells carried across the winter landscape. But these were not the familiar bronze bells of St. Margaret's Tower, which had remained silent throughout all the long winter months. These bells rang with a clarity and purity that seemed to cut through the air like blades of silver, and their sound carried a power that produced an immediate and devastating effect on the transformed sisters. They screamed as one, dropping their cups and clutching their heads, as if the sound were causing them physical agony. The reaction was so extreme and so instantaneous that Catherine initially believed they were witnessing genuine divine intervention. But the truth, as she would come to learn in the days that followed, was both more ordinary and more astonishing. The bells belonged to a rescue party led by Bishop Patrick O'Malley himself, who had indeed received word about the troubling situation at St. Margaret's Convent, not from any letters the novices had written, but from Father Heinrich Metz. The elderly German priest had been growing quietly but persistently concerned about the convent's self-imposed isolation and the total absence of communication from Mother Agatha during the winter months. When the weather finally relented enough to permit travel in early March, he had made the dangerous journey to St. Margaret's to check on the welfare of the sisters himself. What he found there had sent him riding immediately to Pittsburgh to place his concerns before the bishop. Father Metz had discovered the convent's true nature in the most commonplace way imaginable, by arriving unexpectedly and finding the basement chapel in active use during hours when everyone within those walls should have been sleeping. The sight of the transformed sisters conducting their ritual over the body of a novice, who had been officially reported as successfully transferred to another house, had shattered his understanding of what was truly happening at St. Margaret's. But Father Metz was not an ordinary country priest. He was a member of a secret order embedded within the Catholic Church, an organization founded centuries earlier with the specific purpose of identifying and eliminating exactly the kind of corruption that had taken root at St. Margaret's. The Church had learned long ago that certain entities found religious institutions to be ideal camouflage for their activities, and it had developed precise methods for dealing with such infiltrations. Bishop O'Malley and his rescue party had arrived prepared not merely with legal authority, but with deep knowledge of what they were truly facing. The bells they carried had been blessed with holy water and inscribed with prayers in Latin, designed specifically to disrupt the kind of creatures the senior sisters had become. The sound waves they produced created a resonance that interfered directly with whatever supernatural forces were sustaining the transformed beings. As the bells continued to ring, the senior sisters' carefully maintained human forms began to collapse entirely. What remained was far worse than anything Catherine had imagined in her darkest moments, creatures that appeared to be composed as much of shadow and concentrated malice as of physical matter. They writhed and twisted, their forms shifting and reforming constantly, as though they could no longer sustain any stable physical structure. Mother Agatha herself proved far more resilient than her followers. As her human disguise fell completely away, she revealed a form that had clearly persisted for far longer than any mortal creature has any right to exist. Her true appearance was a nightmarish fusion of human and something entirely other, something that might have possessed a terrible beauty once, long ago, but had been utterly corrupted by centuries of feeding on human life force. "You think you have won?" she hissed at the bishop and his men as they entered the storage room, their blessed silver crosses extended before them like weapons. "But you understand nothing of what we truly are. We are eternal. We have concealed ourselves within your churches for 1,000 years, and we will continue to do so for 1,000 more. For every nest you cleanse, 10 more will take root. For every creature you destroy, 20 more will take holy vows. Your faith is our perfect disguise, and your faithful are our perfect prey. Bishop O'Malley's response revealed a depth of understanding that surprised even Catherine. You are neither eternal nor unique, he said, his voice entirely calm as he raised a silver cross that burned with its own interior light. You are parasites feeding on the faith of others because you possess no power of your own. The Church has confronted your kind before, and the Church will confront your kind again. But tonight, your feeding ends. The bishop began to speak words in Latin that Catherine recognized as prayers of exorcism, though these were unlike any religious ceremony she had ever witnessed. The Latin phrases were woven together with words from older languages still, creating a rhythmic chant that seemed to carry the same resonant power as the blessed bells. The effect on Mother Agatha was immediate and devastating. She began to age visibly before their eyes, her stolen immortality finally catching up to her as the supernatural forces sustaining her were methodically dismantled. The sacred substance, Mother Agatha gasped, her voice growing weaker with every passing second as her true age began to assert itself. Without the sacred substance we cannot maintain our forms. You must understand we only take what is freely given. These girls came here willingly, seeking religious life. We simply redirected their devotion toward more worthy recipients. You took their lives, Bishop O'Malley replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute moral certainty. You corrupted their faith and consumed their essence. There is nothing sacred about what you have done here, and there will be no mercy for what you have become. The final moments of Mother Agatha's existence were simultaneously terrible and strangely pitiable. As the bishop's prayers continued their relentless work, she began to collapse inward, her stolen immortality unraveling like a tapestry being pulled apart thread by thread. She reached out toward the novices one final time, her expression a mingling of pure hatred and something that might, long ago, have been regret. We were human once, she whispered, her voice now barely reaching them at all. Long, long ago, we were just like you, young women seeking meaning and purpose in a religious life, but we found something older than Christianity, something that promised us dominion over death itself. We believed we were choosing eternal life, but we chose eternal hunger instead. Remember us not as monsters, but as a warning of what becomes possible when faith is corrupted by desperation. With those words, Mother Agatha crumbled to dust, her centuries of stolen life finally, irrevocably released. The other transformed sisters had already succumbed to the bishop's prayers, their unnatural forms dissolving back into the shadows from which they had first emerged. The storage room fell suddenly, completely silent, save for the quiet sobbing of the 5 surviving novices and the continued ringing of the blessed bells drifting in from outside. But the horror was not entirely finished. As the bishop and his men began to attend to the survivors, they made a discovery that would haunt everyone present for the remainder of their days. The novices, who had been transformed but not yet fully absorbed into the collective consciousness, were still alive. But they existed trapped in a state, suspended between human and monster, that might well have been worse than death itself. These young women retained enough of their original personalities to fully comprehend what had been done to them, but they had been altered too profoundly to ever return to ordinary human life. They begged the bishop to end their suffering, understanding that they could not survive without the sacred substance that had been sustaining their transformed bodies, yet knowing that continuing to consume it would complete their conversion into the very same kind of creatures they had just watched crumble to dust. The bishop faced an impossible choice. Allow these partially transformed novices to die slowly as their altered bodies gave out, or grant them a swift and merciful death that would spare them any further suffering. In the end, he chose mercy, administering last rites to each of the affected young women before releasing their souls from the horror that had ensnared them. The aftermath of that March night was both a victory over evil and a tragedy that would echo through the rest of the lives of everyone who had witnessed it. Of the 17 novices who had entered St. Margaret's Convent, only 5 survived in recognizably human form: Catherine, Margaret, Anne, Rose, and Clara. The remaining 12 had been either consumed entirely, transformed beyond any hope of recovery, or reduced to states that made death a mercy rather than a loss. Bishop O'Malley ordered the convent to be investigated thoroughly and then destroyed. The building was dismantled stone by stone, with every piece examined for evidence of the corruption that had taken hold within its walls. The investigators found far more than they had prepared themselves to encounter: hidden chambers preserving the remains of dozens of young women, ritual artifacts clearly intended for purposes that had nothing to do with Christianity, and records detailing a network of similar institutions stretching across North America and Europe. The Church's official records state that St. Margaret's Convent was closed due to administrative irregularities and questions surrounding the authenticity of the religious order's credentials. No mention was ever made of the true horrors that had been uncovered there, and the surviving documentation was sealed in the Vatican archives under restrictions that continue to prevent public access even today. The Catholic Church had learned centuries ago that publicizing such incidents served only to damage faith in religious institutions while providing little genuine protection to the faithful. The land where the convent had stood was consecrated with prayers of cleansing and then left to return to wilderness. Local residents reported strange occurrences in the surrounding area for several years afterward: unexplained lights, the sound of chanting rising from somewhere underground, a persistent, unshakable feeling that the site retained some taint despite the Church's best efforts at purification. In time, these reports faded, and the location became just another stretch of Pennsylvania forest, indistinguishable from the woodland surrounding it. Catherine Murphy left religious life following her ordeal, but she never surrendered her faith in God. Only her faith in human institutions that claimed to speak for the divine. She married Thomas Sullivan, a physician who had been part of Bishop O'Malley's rescue party, and together they raised 6 children. Catherine lived to the age of 93, becoming a respected figure in her community and a tireless champion for the rights of women and children. But she never once spoke publicly about what she had witnessed at St. Margaret's Convent, carrying the secret with her until her death in 1940. Catherine's private papers, discovered in her great-granddaughter's attic in 1952, included detailed letters describing her experiences at the convent in full. These letters were initially dismissed as the fantasies of a traumatized young woman, but subsequent investigation by church historians established their accuracy, confirming details that matched sealed Vatican records. The letters provide the only first-hand account of what truly occurred during those dark months in the Pennsylvania hills, and they remain among the most deeply disturbing documents in the Church's secret archives. Margaret O'Brien became a physician like her father, one of the first women admitted to medical school in Pennsylvania. She devoted her career to treating the poor and establishing medical facilities in underserved communities. Margaret never married, stating that her experiences at St. Margaret's Convent had shown her the particular ways in which evil targeted those who opened their hearts most fully to others. She died in 1901 while treating victims of a cholera outbreak in Philadelphia, true to her calling to the very end. Anne Fitzgerald returned to her family in Ireland, where she lived a quiet life helping to care for children orphaned by the continuing devastation of the Great Famine. She never spoke of her time in America, and her family assumed she had simply discovered that religious life was not suited to her. Anne died young at 34, her death certificate citing consumption, though her family always believed she had never truly recovered from some experience during her brief time away. Rose McKenna became a teacher in Boston, dedicating her life to educating children from immigrant families. She married late and had 2 children, raising them with a protectiveness that bordered on obsession. Rose's husband later recalled that she suffered frequent nightmares throughout their marriage, regularly waking up screaming about things that had pretended to be holy. She died in 1889, leaving behind explicit written instructions that her children should never, under any circumstances, enter religious life. Clara Walsh became a journalist, one of the first women to write for a major newspaper in Boston. She spent her career pursuing corruption within religious and charitable institutions, building a reputation for fearless reporting on scandals that other journalists gave a wide berth. Clara never married, stating that her experiences had taught her to distrust anyone who claimed authority over the spiritual lives of others. She died in 1905, leaving behind a vast archive of articles exposing financial and moral corruption in religious institutions throughout New England. The 5 survivors maintained correspondence with each other until their deaths, bound together by a shared experience no one else could ever fully understand. Their letters, preserved across multiple family collections, reveal women who never entirely healed from what they had witnessed, but who channeled the trauma into lives of service and vigilance on behalf of others. They developed a private code system for their correspondence, allowing them to share information about potentially dangerous religious institutions without exposing the source of their knowledge. Through this informal network, the 5 women successfully identified and exposed several other religious houses showing signs of the same corruption they had encountered in Pennsylvania. While none of those cases proved as extreme as what they had survived at St. Margaret's, their efforts were instrumental in bringing down institutions that were exploiting vulnerable young people for financial gain or other forms of abuse. The investigation into St. Margaret's Convent revealed a pattern stretching across continents and centuries. The entity calling itself Mother Agatha Rousseau was traced to similar incidents in France, England, and Ireland, suggesting that the corruption was not an isolated phenomenon but part of a vast network of parasitic entities that had perfected the art of exploiting religious institutions for their own purposes. Church records, where they could be accessed at all, revealed recurring patterns of missing novices, unexplained deaths, and religious houses quietly shuttered for administrative reasons throughout the 19th century. Perhaps the most unsettling discovery was the realization that the corruption had not ended with the destruction of St. Margaret's Convent. Bishop O'Malley's private papers, made available to researchers in 1975, referenced 12 other houses that had been cleansed over the following decades, along with correspondence with church authorities in Europe, strongly implying that the problem was international in scope. The bishop spent the remainder of his career developing protocols for identifying and eliminating such corruption, creating a covert department within the church that continued to operate well into the 20th century. The broader implications of the St. Margaret's incident forced the Catholic Church to confront deeply uncomfortable questions about the vulnerability of religious institutions to infiltration by malevolent forces. The very qualities that made religious life appealing to genuinely faithful people, isolation from worldly concerns, absolute obedience to authority, willingness to sacrifice personal desires in service of a higher purpose, also made such institutions attractive targets for those who would exploit such devotion for far darker ends. Church authorities developed new protocols for overseeing religious houses, requiring more frequent inspections and more thorough documentation of the fates of novices and postulants. But these measures were implemented quietly, without any public acknowledgement of the problems they had been designed to address. The Church had learned that admitting to such infiltrations would erode faith in religious institutions, while providing no real benefit to those the institutions were meant to serve. Catherine's final letter, written shortly before her death in 1940, contained a warning that resonates with unusual force given everything that followed. The true enemy of faith is not disbelief but false faith. Evil does not always announce itself with obvious signs of corruption. Sometimes it dresses itself in the robes of angels and speaks the language of salvation. Sometimes it builds institutions that appear identical to places of genuine worship, staffed by people who seem to embody the very highest ideals of religious devotion. Trust in God, Catherine continued, but be wary of those who claim to speak for him with absolute and unquestionable authority. Question any religious institution that demands complete isolation from family and friends. Be suspicious of any spiritual teacher who discourages inquiry or independent thought. The wolves are always present among the sheep, and they are always hungry. They have learned to wear our clothing, speak our language, and exploit our most noble impulses for the darkest of purposes. This story of St. Margaret's Convent stands as a reminder that the corruption of religious institutions represents one of the most insidious forms of evil, precisely because it exploits humanity's most elevated aspirations for the lowest possible ends. It shows us how those seeking to serve God can become prey for those who would turn such devotion against them, and how the very structures created to protect and nurture faith can become instruments of destruction when corrupted by malevolent forces working from within. The mystery also demonstrates the enduring importance of maintaining a healthy skepticism even within religious contexts, and the need for genuine transparency and accountability in all institutions that claim any form of spiritual authority. The young women who entered St. Margaret's Convent were guilty of nothing more than wishing to dedicate their lives to others. Yet they became victims of a corruption that had spent generations concealing itself behind the facade of holy devotion. Perhaps most importantly, the story shows us that fighting such corruption requires both spiritual conviction and practical vigilance operating together. Bishop O'Malley and his team succeeded not through prayer alone, but through careful, methodical investigation, preparation with the right knowledge and tools, and the willingness to take decisive action the moment the evidence of evil became undeniable. The combination of faith and reason, of spiritual authority and practical wisdom, proved to be the essential key to overcoming forces that had operated in darkness for decades. This is a mystery that shows us how the purest intentions can be consumed by the darkest evil, and how faith itself can become a weapon in the hands of those willing to exploit it. The story of St. Margaret's Convent reminds us that not all religious houses are sanctuaries, and not all who take holy vows do so with holy purposes. Sometimes the deepest horrors conceal themselves behind the most sacred facades, wearing the masks of angels while serving the purposes of something far older and far darker. What do you make of this story? Do you believe everything that happened at St. Margaret's Convent has truly come to light? Are there other religious institutions that might be concealing similar secrets even now? Have you ever encountered a religious organization that gave you an uneasy feeling you couldn't quite explain? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and share them with our community of mystery seekers. If you found this story gripping and want more like it, subscribe, ring the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves a good mystery as much as you do. Remember, the truth is very often stranger and far more terrifying than fiction. And sometimes the most important stories are precisely the ones that powerful institutions work hardest to keep buried. See you in the next video, where we'll step into another dark chapter hidden within America's religious history.